Welcome to Native Exiles, Alderwood Community Church's podcast about living in the world but not being of the world. It's a tension we live in, and one of the tensions we feel is in the area of evangelism. We've been talking about this, and I have a couple of guests today, my friends Rick and Lisa Kellum. They have served Christ overseas, served him here, and are really gifted in this area. They are telling me they want to demystify the E word. So hopefully we'll bring some encouragement and clarity to you in the podcast. Thanks for joining us. Well, I'm so glad to be here today with my two friends, Rick and Lisa Kellum. We've been talking about evangelism, and that's something Rick and Lisa are passionate about. Great examples to me in that area. But before we talk a little bit about what you guys are doing, who you are, your ministry, let's talk about where you've come from. You've been in ministry for a long time. Before you were here in the Pacific Northwest, you were in a very different part of the world. Tell us a little bit about that, Lisa.
Well, we're both from the Pacific Northwest, and so we did start there a little bit. But God called us overseas to France, and that was a great time of our life. We spent 20 years over there, and our kids were born and raised there, so they're dual citizens. And that was completely strange to me because I never thought about being an overseas missionary, just a normal gal that wants to share Jesus, but he called us there, and it was one of the dearest times of our lives.
That's awesome. Rick, tell us a little bit about what kind of ministry you were doing there in France.
Yeah, primarily evangelism, discipleship on the campus, so like a university chaplain. So we did outreach in different forms, small group Bible studies, outreach just on campus, go up to people and sharing our faith that way. Cold calls or randoms. We call them randoms. That was a small part. It wasn't the whole thing. It was more relationship building with students and then also discipling Christian students.
And then you moved back here to the Pacific Northwest. How many years back was that?
10 years now.
Wow.
Yeah.
So glad to have you as a part of our church body here. And I just do have to mention, we were talking with our show producer, Luke, before the show, and we learned we have 4 listeners in France. So we're really excited to be able to give them a taste of our French friends here at Alderwood. So, we've been talking about how difficult evangelism is, how intimidating and foreboding it is for a lot of us. I was just out of nowhere this last week thinking of a interaction I had years ago. I'm a missionary kid myself. I was a missionary kid returning to my parents overseas in this long trans-Pacific flight, and I'm a Bible major in college, so, I'm well prepared. It's coming. You're on the airplane. That person's sitting next to you. I mean, it was like the most open door you've ever seen. She started asking me why I was returning to Taiwan. Oh, my parents are missionaries. Next thing you know, we're talking about the faith. After that, it went slightly down. As some evangelistic conversations are wont to do, she starts asking me questions about like the Nietzschean view of the world and existentialism and nihilism. And, as my 20-year-old self, I'm like staring blankly back at her, making stuff up, trying to come up with answers, quoting verses, just getting increasingly nowhere with her. And like the worst part of it is I'm probably raising my voice because it soon becomes evident to me that like people around me in the cabin are staring back at me awkwardly like, who is this freak, right? So, that's just one of those stories. We've talked about how it's so, the caricature of evangelism is that sort of combative, conversation with a stranger. You guys have spent your lives trying and I think really learning a lot about relational evangelism. Before we talk about just what you're doing now, why is that so important? Just this, because this is where we're going to go with the podcast. Why is relational evangelism so important rather than just, here's the truth, believe it, or I'm moving on?
Yeah. Well, one thing is important is that's where most people are at, right? Most people are not going on the campus and doing evangelism that way, or not going to the mall. That's a good exercise, and I have nothing against that. But that's not really where people are at. They're in their workplace, they're with their families, they're with their neighbors. And that's the everyday life. So that's where we want to encourage people.
That's where we spend the majority of our time.
Right.
And I think, too, we've just seen people want community. People, at least in our neighborhood, you come home, the garage door goes up, the car goes in, and it goes down. And there's just not people interacting. And yet you see this void that people want to relate, but they don't know how, or how to initiate, or how close do I get, or do I want to be private? And before you can share anything about your life, whether it's just your kids or what you're doing, is you have to have a relationship,
Yeah.
and that takes time and that takes intentionality and being curious.
Such a good word, curious. I think in some ways it's the forgotten virtue of
Mm.
evangelism. We so quickly go to our answers, our pat answers, our fixed answers, instead of just listening to someone, caring about someone. So you guys are really focused on this type of evangelism now. When you first came back from France, though, you were in a unique type of ministry before you're in the ministry you're in now. Talk a little bit about that transition of the last several
Yeah,
years.
when we came back from France, we transitioned back into the campus ministry, but working with international students at the University of Washington, and then, scholars there as well, and then also at the community college level.
Which is amazing because, I mean, it's incredible how many folks from around the world come to our country to get a good education, and we have an opportunity there. You were a part of that ministry for several years, but talk a little bit now about the ministry that you've moved into and how you got there.
I think, Rick said that there's people all around us, and there's an open field.
Mm-hmm.
We wanted to get to know neighbors. We saw people. We began to build relationships, and we thought, wow, this is right in front of us. We don't have to go onto a campus or go to a certain country. We can share Christ's way of life. And I think, after so many years on staff with a Christian organization, maybe you talked about this. The hard part is like, there are these shoulds.
Yeah.
I should share my faith. I should, we obviously want people to know Jesus deeply because our lives have been transformed. But what if it wasn't a should? What if it was like, this is an overflow? When I get to know someone and they get to know me, we start talking about life. What's important in your life? And it spills. It spills. And
Yeah.
so
You can't help it.
we want that spillage to go, something that's really important to me is Jesus.
Isn't it amazing? Like, we'll talk to strangers about other things we care about. So the Mariners,
For example,
or my new car, or my vacation last summer, all these things. And we have common ground there. But that joy and that fullness and that new life we have in Jesus, how can we not talk about it? But Rick, why do we get so uptight, do you think? Because it should be as natural as talking about our grandkids or a memory we have.
I think Pastor Wyatt has talked about this a number in his series about just the disconnect between us and a lot of times and non-believers in our culture and the different things that are focused. But we have a lot, probably more similarities than we have differences, just because of having families and going through everyday life.
Yep.
But I think it's I kind of call it the castle mentality. Run out of your castle, throw down a track, and run back. And hope you'll be
Pull
safe.
the drawbridge
Right,
out.
right, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think we have that mentality because that's kind of what we've been trained, I don't know, to do, or not trained, but what we think evangelism isn't. But evangelism really ultimately is relational and sharing our faith. And look at Jesus as the example. Woman at the well,
Yes.
Nicodemus. He had different approaches for different people, but he basically shared himself. Or the Apostle Paul has great examples at being contextual to the people that he's talking to.
Yeah, I think that's such an important thing to recognize, that you've both used the phrase now, way of life, that there's something about the way of life that Jesus offers to us. There's also something about our way of life being part of our evangelism. We think often of evangelism almost strictly in verbal terms, but so much of it is the way of life that Jesus gives us: peace and community and joy and a connection with the God who loves us. So I think that's something we want to explore in the context of what we're going to call neighboring, because that's a term I've learned from you guys. Talk a little bit about neighboring and how does neighboring connect to evangelism?
It's being a neighbor. There's.
I'm thinking of Mr. Rogers
Yeah.
now. And it's a beautiful
I
day
think
in the
there's this
neighborhood.
false thing of being a good neighbor is, mowing my grass and keeping quiet and not getting too close to someone, because that will be offensive and those kinds of things. And as I mentioned before, we've really found that people want to have community. And so I think the first thing is just, hey, it can be as simple as going up to the mailbox and you haven't met someone and you introduce yourself and you start chatting, and then the next time you might see them again.
Right.
Not supernatural in the sense of, yeah, God has to
I
do
get what you
it,
mean.
but
It's very
it's
natural.
very natural. And so I think God just began to give us a love for people around us in the sense of, I want them to know more.
Mm-hmm.
But we know to do that, I have to really love them and I have to be concerned about them. And to do that, I have to know them. What is their life? What is their story? And that's just one really easy way of like, hey, I'd love to hear your story sometime, and then there's a mutual sharing of stories, but there's always these little clues of either common ground or a difficulty or something that the Lord allows later to maybe step into that and share a different perspective.
You're back on that curiosity thing, and it's so important, isn't it? Let's take a break here, and when we come back, I'd love to just hear a story of how this has worked for you. Might be a catastrophe like my airplane interchange, or it might be a story of great joy and victory. Hope that phrase settled in for you, the audience. Neighboring, just being a neighbor, reaching out to our neighbors in a very natural way, with the way of life that Jesus offers us, the gospel that Jesus offers us. That's what you guys are doing. I want the good, the bad, or the ugly. Give us a story of what this might look like and how it's gone down.
Well, before you share, we're still learning. I just want to say that, and so we're still learning this. So I want to encourage people as saying, be encouraged to try something.
Yeah.
Don't be afraid to fail. So we're still learning, and people are at different levels in our neighborhood. So I just wanted to throw that in first.
Thanks for that encouragement, Rick.
So there was this couple, I think it was a couple of 4th of Julys, they moved in. And so we have a 4th of July thing in our cul-de-sac. And so we wanted to introduce ourselves and meet them. And I mean, this couple, they are extremely different from us. Different worldview. He's Australian and older, had been married before. She is just this wild woman full of color and life. And so we just kind of got to know them a little bit at that event. And we would see them and connect. And it's really interesting to watch. I felt like God just knitted our hearts together. So they've been coming to our soup nights, and they're always hugging us. And just anyway, it's a really.
Wait, I have to interrupt you. Soup nights. What is that?
So part of what we do in our neighborhood is we have a monthly event. And so in the winter, it's a soup night, so people can just come in from the cold and grab a bowl of soup and
Cool.
chat for a while. In the nicer weather, we've done like appetizers on the driveway. We have special events like Easter and Christmas with brunches. So anyway, the soup night is one of our winter events.
So you just invite the neighbors over, anybody who wants
Yeah.
to come. We're having a soup night.
Right.
And
Yeah.
people actually come.
People actually
come.
come.
That's probably
Yeah.
because you're a wonderful cook.
I
In
know.
fact, I know you are. But so you met this couple at this soup night, so different from you, and like, where has it gone from there?
Well, actually, for one of the ones in December, he came by himself, and I could just tell because we know him and know them. I saw that his countenance was just low. I thought something's going on, and so I made it my point to sit by him for dinner, and I just said, "Hey, Andrew, how are you doing?" And he began to spill his heart. His wife was not doing well,
And you'd known him for a while at this point.
Yeah,
It's relational equity.
Right,
Yeah.
right. And he wanted, he so that was on his mind, but also he had a daughter that was sort of going off the rails, and just he was just dealing with all of this stuff. And he opens up that he had some Christian background,
Wow.
but had gotten really hurt by the church and by some Christians. And so I just listened. I think that's the biggest thing. We think we have to say all these things, but as we listen and really care, God's Spirit just helps us move to the next level. And so I just said, Andrew, I am so sorry. This just breaks my heart. And I just want you to know that that's not the Jesus that I know.
Wow.
And I want you to maybe be able to take a different look, at Christianity and what he represents. And I'm sorry that humans have hurt you so deeply, and that we care about you. And so that just opened up, other conversations to go deeper.
That's such a beautiful story, Lisa. Thanks for sharing that. It resonates on so many levels. First of all, just hearing you talk about the credibility you had, with him, being able to say, that we love you, we care about you. That's that way of life, the credibility you've earned by just being a friend and being willing to listen. But Rick, I'm also chuckling a little to myself as I prepare to ask you a question, because you guys are crew missionaries. Now, I don't know how many of our audience would be familiar with Campus Crusade for Christ as it was formerly known, but one of the things we've actually already sort of lampooned on the last episode was the 4 spiritual laws, right? This tract you handed out, these 4 very tight answers that just solved any and every problem, and you couldn't wait to just land on those and give them the gospel and see what their response is going to be. You're kind of presenting a very different approach in this neighboring relational approach. Talk about why that's important as you introduce to us some of the other ways you reach out to your neighbors.
Well, I think we've talked about, even personally, about not making your neighbors your project.
Like a target.
Like a target, and that you're trying to accomplish, or you're trying to reach and gain those type of points. So it's trickier in the sense of, if you're on campus, that's what you're there for. You can have different transitions. You can use different tools to get there. But in neighboring, the rules have changed. And I give the example of, let's say you're a professional ping pong player and you are really good at it, and then all of a sudden you're transitioning to be a tennis player on a gigantic tennis court, and it's a totally different game. It's a racket sport. There's a net,
right?
But that's the only similarity, right? And the volleys are long, and sometimes the ball doesn't come back. You kick the ball over there, and it doesn't come back, or doesn't come back for several days or weeks or months. And it's a building. It's relational. It's building. So you're building relational equity, is what you use that so well. And that's what we're trying to do, I think, with neighboring. And you never know how it might come up.
How do you do that? Besides soup nights, which that's brilliant, what are some other ways you connect with your neighbors intentionally?
Well, I think even simply saying hello, starting with
There's
hello.
a novel idea.
Friends of ours, Chris and Elizabeth McKinney, wrote a book on neighboring, and they said, remove the word just from your vocabulary. I just gave them cookies. I just waved. I just helped them with their lawn. All those counts. You get points for all those. So you're building relationship to have credibility in order to share the gospel at some point. But see it in sharing the gospel in segments, not everything at the same time. It's not an info dump with them. You might, a lot of times it's on felt needs, kind of like what Lisa shared.
Getting to the heart.
Getting to the heart of where people are. That means you have to listen. That means you have to be present. That means you have to engage in what they're going through and not have the focus on yourself.
I'll just put a little quip here. The interesting thing, when we transitioned from student and even the scholar ministry to what's called Crew City, so it's really community ministry. It's not just our neighborhood, but it was in COVID.
Oh.
And we're like, oh my gosh, what are we going to do now? The doors are really closed.
How's this going to work?
Yeah, but then you knew even more that people were desiring some kind of, relationship. So we started out with one couple at a time with masks, those that felt comfortable, just to get to know someone else in our neighborhood.
Wow.
And then God expanded it from there.
It's not a bait and switch, right? We're not just making a mark out of this person. We really care. We really love. We're genuinely curious. We hurt with them. We laugh with them. I'm hearing that in what you say. Let me bring up a poke at this a little bit. I'm thinking about the person who might have a thought like, wow, you look at Jesus and his ministry. I mean, he just met people along the way and spoke the truth. Of course, he did have those healing powers too. I'm waiting for you guys to open your healing clinic here soon. But, Jesus, it was a quick transaction. It was a stranger, kind of like we were saying earlier, is exactly the caricature. Like, why do you think it's different for us now? What's unique about Jesus? Or should we all just be out like Jesus? Like you said earlier, Rick, going to the mall, walking the streets, and Shazam, there's that interaction. Why is it different now, or different for us on some level than it was for Jesus?
We have some aspects in our culture where it's a little bit taboo to talk about religion and politics because it brings up so much potential conflict
And distrust,
and
right?
distrust
Yeah.
and caricatures maybe of what Christians are. So going in from different angles, I think, is that missional contextualization that we talked about,
Yeah.
and approaching it for a more need-based or a feeling-based approach to that, and seeing people as people and not as projects, as we said. So I think that's the difference, and and finding that common ground to be able to cultivate that relationship, and maybe even going back to that. In some conversation you had with a potential neighbor, and they mentioned maybe someone in their family that's sick, you go back and you ask them about that sick person, and hey, how's your dad doing with that? That shows care. That shows interest. It's not a formula necessarily. You do genuinely care, and then even sharing things about praying. Lisa and I will pray for that. We'd love to pray for that, and you could even maybe offer to pray for that now if they feel comfortable with that.
Mm-hmm.
But that gets you already to a spiritual aspect, and it shows care. Prayer shows care, I think,
Yeah.
to people. So that's just an example.
Those are great opportunities and ways to connect. I think about the fact, too, that, of course, Jesus is God. So he already knows that person intimately, right? And it's also easy for us to forget that not every one of Jesus' interactions ended with that person accepting him.
Mm-hmm.
So Jesus endured rejection like any of us will when we
Right.
share the gospel. I know you guys have a lot of other ways that you reach out to your neighbors creatively too. Lisa, share some of the other ways that you do that. Like when you do have these meals, for instance, and that's so biblical, right? We talk about table fellowship, and there's just something about gathering around a table with another human being. It immediately forges a bond of some sort. As you have these different meals together, what are some ways you seek to maybe move the conversation towards spiritual things?
Yeah. We've done different things. Some things are creative and some things are not so creative. But one thing is, I don't know if it was Valentine's Day. There's this tool called Solarium, like SOUL, which is they're cards that are pictures of people and places and things and
Interesting.
moods and so there's the pile of cards. We had each person pick out a card that represents what they think about God, or what represents your marriage or something like that. And so then they would share the card and say, well, I picked this card because, and then you kind of get into things.
Interesting.
A couple of times we've just done like kind of a theme, like let's talk people sharing about this, this or that. I think really the most successful is when it's not time sensitive in the sense, like our soup nights are more, hey, don't worry about meal tonight, just
Sort
come
of
over,
unhurried.
yeah, grab a bowl, and you don't even have to stay long. But like the appetizers on the driveway in the summer, bring an appetizer to share, a beverage to share, people will hang out. I mean, and those are the really interesting conversations, and then you really see how much this is needed,
Wow.
this community. We've got a couple actually from Bosnia. They have a very, very tight schedule in their job and all that, but when they come to those appetizers on the driveway, 3 hours, because they want to talk, and so again, you get to hear what they're thinking about, and introducing what you think about things, and that it's just really natural, but it's so laid back that they feel cared for. And so I got a text from one of the ladies, and she goes, "Thank you so much. You have brought us all together."
People
And
are so hungry for
they
that, aren't
they
they?
are hungry.
Just genuine love, care, and community.
And I don't think they are opposed to the gospel as much. I think the enemy wants to tell us that, and society wants to tell us
Right.
that. But when you establish a relationship of caring and loving and mutual trust, and I share that this was really meaningful to me, that's
Yeah.
not offensive at all.
Yeah. Yeah, you have credibility. We keep going back to that. Rick, I love the spiritual Rorschach ink blot test approach, the solarium. That's fantastic. And I know you guys have tried some other things. Didn't you do something at Easter this last year where you posted a question on a whiteboard or something like
Yeah,
that?
we had the whiteboard. This is something that we've done in France where it's called a wall of expression. And you put up a question there, and actually Mallory did it in France this year.
Your daughter, Mallory, yep.
And so it's just a question, what do you think about God or whatever? This was like, what does Easter mean to you? And like in one or two words, what does Easter mean to you? And like we put up, hope, or, we put things on there too.
Yeah.
Yeah, but the other people put, pastels,
And
things like.
were people open to having that conversation? Maybe some more than others. Like, what was the response?
Yeah, it was kind of short. They didn't share too much about it. They'd write on there, and then we'd say, "What? Tell me about that." And like I said, someone put pastels. So you're just talking about
Very
colors
deep.
and things
Ham.
like. But I think the
Ham,
fact,
yeah.
ham. I think the fact that we had the question there, and we had maybe other things there, and we have in other years we've actually handed out. We handed out a little booklet on Easter. It's written by Rebecca McLaughlin. It's a gal that wrote just kind of an apologetic, a little thing.
Yeah.
And we just said,
She's
this
an
is
excellent writer.
yeah, it's something that we thought it was a really clear approach of Easter, and we wanted to share that with you. So that's a little more of a direct approach, and we found in general Christmas and Easter is a little more sociably acceptable to be a
Right.
little more direct about spiritual things. And so we're able to do that, and then that can spark
You can
conversations.
talk about traditions, for those
Right.
things as well.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. We've been kind of teasing this topic of the way of life and how it gives credibility to the message. I was thinking of a scripture that I think is really helpful here because Paul talks so much about this. Jesus' ministry, as we kind of mentioned, it was unique. 3 years on earth, he's the Son of God. He knows each person intimately. But Paul's ministry probably looks a little closer to what we're doing. He planted himself in a community. He got to know people. We see his epistles, and he gives names of the people that he had long-term relationships. But he says this to one of the folks that he was very close to, young Timothy, in the book of 2 Timothy. He says, "You, Timothy, know all about my teaching, my way of life, my purpose, faith, patience, love, endurance, persecutions and sufferings." And he goes on to encourage Timothy to continue in the faith and to keep living the faith because he's convinced from what he's seen in Paul. That's powerful, isn't it? That our lives are as important as the 4 spiritual laws, or even the Romans Road, or any scriptures that we could share. Talk a little bit more about the way of life that you think we're called to demonstrate as Christians, and what's winsome. Like what do we really want to be clear in communicating and showing with our way of life?
We talked about consistency, right? That sense with the consistency builds the trust, builds the relationship. We have what we call the check-in ministry. And so this is our texting ministry. So as we've gotten to know these neighbors and we've got their text, that's how we invite them to our things. And so, we've got an older gentleman that is having hip problems, and he's going to be having surgery, and then he just found out he had some heart stuff. So, we see him walking the dog. If we don't, we text, "Sherry, how's it going? Did you have that appointment?"
Just that concern and care.
Right. The couple that we told you about that's really different from us, he was going back to Australia for a couple of weeks. And so I said, "Hey, is there anything that we can do for your wife?" Her name is Ed for short. It's Edwina, Aaron something. Anyway, so I said, "We'll check in with her, make sure she's doing okay."
That's great.
And he texted back, "Thanks so much." So you, in your curiosity and your caring and really listening, these things come up. And
Yeah.
so we just text people and just say, "We're checking in. How are things going?"
Curiosity, interest, concern, prayer. Rick, anything you'd add to the way of life that's winsome?
I think we've talked about this a little bit. Just finding common ground, finding things that relate to them, that we relate to. I think one thing we forget about is talking like a real person. Not dropping your Christianese and
Right.
all that, and being a real person. Talking about spiritual things in a really approachable way.
Without saying, "Have you heard the 4 spiritual laws?"
Exactly.
Maybe not using
Exactly.
that one. Okay.
And I think, and we've talked about this a little bit too, is we say create a better story as things come up with death, with sickness, with all the things that are happening in the world. is you can give a little micro testimonies to say, like, as a Christian, I've really found that my relationship with Christ helps me so much to have hope in a world that's really hopeless. Even certain that short can really affect people to make them think about a relationship with Christ, and that opens up a door for more conversation. Even to say, "Have you? What's your background?" I think that's people say, "Hey, well, how do you train people to share their faith?" And I said, ask them about their spiritual background. It's not rocket science, really. Putting the cookies on the bottom level, and saying, "Hey, tell me about your faith journey, or tell me about your story, or did you grow up going to church, and was that positive or negative?"
That's so
And
interesting.
You can go. You can go. You don't have to. You don't have to go. Okay, I got to remember 10 things.
Right, right. I mean, just that's one question that's not offsides in our very, politically correct culture. You're allowed to ask people about their experience, and it is remarkable, isn't it? I find this with my neighbors, how common it is for people to have a lot more spiritual background than you might expect. Whether it was growing up in church or having a relative who shared their faith with them when they were young, or an example that they saw in someone who was a believer. Yeah, really, really good stuff. Well, I have appreciated so much, not just having the two of you here to share in your friendship with Holly and me, but again, your example is really encouraging because you're persistent. That's what I've probably learned the most in our friendship and in knowing you both, is you just stick with it. And like you said earlier, Rick, you don't get discouraged when it doesn't always go great. You just keep going back and loving people, and that sounds a lot like Jesus. Maybe one closing story. I know you guys have shared several with me, but maybe share a story that would just encourage the folks that are listening that this is doable and God blesses this.
Yeah. I would love to do that.
Awesome.
So going back to the COVID time and inviting couples, a new couple had just moved into the house across the street from us. And one thing that we do now is we have a little welcome bag for people.
Great.
It could be, popcorn and chocolates and, always has our name and phone number. Welcome to the neighborhood. If you need anything, just to kind of get things started. So, because some people, they're new to the actual area,
right?
As
they know
well.
No one, yeah.
So anyway, we had done that, but then we invited this couple over for dinner, and we did ask just, "Hey, your background, tell us your story." Well, he had a Catholic background, but went to Christian schools, and so he, was very familiar with, language and Jesus and all of that. But his then fiance, she really didn't have a Christian background. And but they were toying with, now that they're going to get married, well, maybe this will be important to us because it's so important to the young man. And so we picked up in the conversation, listening. I really don't have any background. She had some students or whatever say, "Oh, you're going to hell because you didn't accept Jesus into your life." That was the only, but
Wow.
not really anything positive. And I said, "Wow, I would expect with that you would not be interested at all." And she said, "No, because of us getting married and making these decisions." But she goes, "I really don't know anything. I don't even know Bible stories."
Wow.
So with her not knowing Bible stories, we thought the series The Chosen, if maybe some people are familiar with that, about the life of Jesus.
Yeah.
That's very winsome and very demonstrative
So well done,
of
too. Yeah.
who he is. We thought, hey, why don't we watch The Chosen and invite them to watch with us and just talk about it?
Did you have soup?
We did not have soup.
Okay.
And so that's how we started 3 years ago. So it went from The Chosen to our church, has done a course called Alpha that allows people to have questions about Christianity. And we invited them to that, but they were not able to come with their schedule. So we brought Alpha to them. And so we go from their house to our house to their house.
Is that free? You can get it free on
You can get on YouTube.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's what we did.
Yeah.
And so that sparked more. Well, meanwhile, they needed someone to marry them.
Enter Rick Kellum.
And so we did a little bit of premarital counseling. And
That's amazing.
We got to share the full gospel. She was totally on board, but she'd just never been exposed.
Yeah.
And so we had an outreach to her parents, his parents, their siblings. I mean, and so this thing has just grown over the last 3 years. And now they have just had their first child. And we're like Mimi and Pops. We're the grandparents.
That's great.
We're in the family.
We still have a Bible study with them, going through the book of John, asking questions. They bought Bibles for this Bible study. They mark
taking
questions.
notes.
And so this journey is continuing. And we believe that their heart is close to Jesus, but that whole surrender, the thing of surrender. And that's what we're working through now. They're on board in all ways, but the trust, she calls us family. She sent a text and just said, I can't believe from that first time that you welcomed us to the neighborhood, you stuck with us, and now you're our family.
That is a beautiful story. And it illustrates so many of the things I want our audience to take away. I mean, nothing you did there was tremendously complicated or erudite. You didn't, have to read a ton of books. You just loved these people. You reached out to them as friends. You entered their lives. You shared the good news of the gospel in really approachable, accessible ways. But it also illustrates something that I think we should close on. And that is, some like me who maybe have this negative caricature that I shared earlier, that this is always this stressful interaction with a complete stranger, would hear what you talked about with neighboring, if we'll call it that, and say, oh, this is great. Wow, I'm off the hook now. It's not so burdensome. I could do this. But your story also points to something that's really profound, and that is it still takes emotional energy. It still takes time. It still takes vulnerability on your part and opening up your life and being willing to go in it for the long haul. If the response isn't I love Jesus and I'm ready to give him my life after 2 weeks, you don't quit. So I think that's important for us to remember. Rick, I'm going to give you the last word, and I'd love it if you could encourage our listeners with just maybe one thing, one sort of low-hanging fruit. Like if you want to get started just reaching out to the people around you in your life for Jesus with the gospel, what's an easy way to start that journey?
It sounds really simple, but just take the time to go across the street and introduce yourself if you don't know them, or invite them to a meal. And I think that is an intimate relationship, is
right.
Having somebody over, or if you think, oh, that's too much, have them over for dessert or whatever, but initiate with them. And you mentioned it yourself, it's loving on people.
Yeah.
It's being interested in people. It's being present and listening to their story. That's what I would say. Take the time to listen to people. You're at the mailbox, don't be rushed off. That person comes up, introduce yourself if you don't know them, or say hi. And so it's initiating toward people, and God will open up doors. He'll open up doors, but you need to be available to do that. And people are at different levels, like we talked about. Not everybody is at the level like this couple,
sure.
Right? Others will. We have people that we're inviting every single time, and we're wondering why we're continuing to invite them because they're not coming. But maybe just the fact that we're inviting them is an initiative, and they're going like, why don't we go sometime?
It's a big statement.
So I just say take the initiative to go across the street and introduce yourself. That's a low hanging fruit. Say hello and introduce yourself, or say, hey, welcome to the neighborhood. We're glad you're here. If you have any questions, just contact me, and then allow God to develop that relationship as he wants.
That's
low
such
and
great.
Slow.
Low and slow.
Yeah.
That's a great piece of advice. And we all know great neighbors who aren't necessarily following Jesus. That's not uniquely Christian, but neighboring in the name of Jesus, with the love of Jesus, for the sake of Jesus and the sake of other people, is something I see in your lives, and something we know from God's word he's going to bless, and he's going to produce fruit. Thank you both so much for being here, encouraging us in this challenging task of evangelism, and just giving us some real creative, tangible ways we can do that.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Steve.
This is fun.
It's always so good when we can be challenged and encouraged with real life stories from people like Rick and Lisa who've lived the life, walked the walk. I hope that was really, really helpful for you. I hope they have succeeded in their goal, at least to some degree, demystifying evangelism for you. Hope you're encouraged to walk out into the world and share Jesus, and we look forward to seeing you again next time on Native Exiles.